The Lives of the Saints by the Reverend Alban Butler, taken from the 4th edition, published in 1954. September 5th, St. Lawrence Justinian, confessor and the first patriarch of Venice. St. Lawrence was born at Venice in 1380. His father, Bernardo Justiniani, held an illustrious rank among the prime nobility of the Commonwealth, nor was the extraction of his mother, Querini, less noble. By the death of Bernardo, she was left a disconsolate widow with a nursery of tender children. Though very young, she thought it her duty to sanctify her soul by the great means and advantages which her state afforded for virtue, and resolutely rejected all thoughts of any move altering her condition. Under her inspection, her children were brought up in the most perfect maxims of Christian piety. Lawrence discovered even from the cradle an uncommon docility and an extraordinary generosity of soul, and, disdaining to lose any part of his time, loved only serious conversation and employs. His mother, fearing some spark of pride and ambition, chid him sometimes for aiming at things above his age, but he humbly answered that it was his only desire by the divine grace to become a saint. In the 19th year of his age, he was called by God to consecrate himself in a special manner to his service. He seemed one day to see in a vision the eternal wisdom in the disguise and habit of a damsel, shining brighter than the sun, and to hear from her the following words: "Why seekest thou rest to thy mind out of thyself, sometimes in this object, and sometimes in that? What thou desirest is to be found only with me. Behold, it is in my hands. Seek it in me, who am the wisdom of God. By taking me for thy spouse and thy portion, thou shalt be possessed of its inestimable treasure." That instant he found his soul so pierced with the charms, incomparable honor, and advantages of this invitation of divine grace that he felt himself inflamed with new ardor to give himself up entirely to the search of the holy knowledge and love of God. A religious state appeared to him that in which God pointed out to him the path in which he might most securely attain to the great and arduous end which he proposed to himself. But, before he determined himself, he made his application to God by humble prayer, and addressed himself for advice to a holy and learned priest, called Marino Querini, who was his uncle by the mother's side, and a regular canon in the austere congregation of St. George in Alga, established in a little isle which bears that name, situate a mile from the city of Venice, toward the continent. The prudent director, understanding that he was most inclined to a religious state, advised him first to make trial of his strength by inuring himself to the habitual practice of austerities. Lawrence readily obeyed, and in the night, leaving his soft bed, lay on knotty sticks on the floor. During this deliberation he one day represented to himself on one side honors, riches, and worldly pleasures, and on the other the hardships of poverty, fasting, watching, and self-denial. Then said to himself, "Hast thou courage, my soul, to despise these delights, and to undertake a life of uninterrupted penance and mortification?" After standing some time in a pause, he cast his eyes on a crucifix and said, "Thou, O Lord, art my hope. In this tree are found comfort and strength." The ardor of his resolution to walk in the narrow path of the cross showed itself in the extreme severity with which he treated his body, and the continual application of his mind to the exercises of religion. His mother and other friends, fearing lest his excessive mortifications should prove prejudicial to his health, endeavored to divert him from that course, and, with this view, contrived a proposal of an honorable match to be made him. The saint, perceiving in this stratagem that his friends had entered into a conspiracy to break his measures, fled secretly to the monastery of St. George in Alba, and was admitted to the religious habit. By the change of his state he found no new austerities which he had not before practiced. His superiors even judged it necessary to mitigate the rigors which he exercised upon himself. He was only 19 years of age, but surpassed in his watchings and fasts all his religious brethren. To make a general assault upon sensuality, he never took any useless recreation, subdued his body by severe discipline, and never came near a fire in the sharpest weather of winter, though his hands were often benumbed with cold. He allowed to hunger only what the utmost necessity required, and never drank out of meals. When asked to do it under excessive heats and weariness, he used to say, "If we cannot bear this thirst, how shall we endure the fire of purgatory?" From the same heroic disposition proceeded his invincible patience in every kind of sickness. During his novitiate he was afflicted with dangerous scrofulous swellings in his neck. The physicians described cupping, lancing, and searing with fire. Before the operation, seeing others tremble for this sake, he courageously said to them, "What do you fear? Let the razors and burning irons be brought in. Cannot he grant me constancy who not only supported, but even preserved from the flames the 3 children in the furnace?" Under the cutting and burning he never so much as fetched a sigh, and only once pronounced the holy name of Jesus. Humiliations he always embraced with singular satisfaction. The meanest and most loathsome offices and the most tattered habit were his desire and delight. The beck of any superior was to him as an oracle. Even in private conversation he was always ready to yield to the judgment and will of others, and he sought everywhere the lowest place, as much as was possible to be done without affectation. When he went about the streets begging alms with a wallet on his back, he often thrust himself into the thickest crowds and into assemblies of the nobility, that he might meet with derision and contempt. Being one day put in mind that by appearing loaded with his wallet in a certain public place he would expose himself to the ridicule of the company, he answered to his companion, "Let us go boldly in quest of scorn. We have done nothing if we have renounced the world only in words. Let us today triumph over it with our sacks and crosses. Nothing is of greater advantage toward gaining a complete victory over ourselves and the fund of pride, which is our greatest obstacle to virtue, than humiliations accepted and borne with cheerfulness and sincere humility. To those which Providence daily sends us opportunities of, it is expedient to add some that are voluntary, provided the choice be discreet, and accompanied with heroic dispositions of soul, clear of the least tincture of affectation or hypocrisy. Our saint frequently came to beg at the house where he was born, but only stood in the street before the door, crying out, "An alms, for God's sake." His mother never failed to be exceedingly moved at hearing his voice, and to order the servants to fill his wallet. But he never took more than 2 loaves, and, wishing peace to those who had done him that charity, departed as if he had been some stranger. The storehouse to which were laid up the provisions of the community for a year, happening to be burnt down, St. Lawrence, hearing a certain brother lament for the loss, said cheerfully, "Why have we embraced and vowed poverty? God has granted us this blessing that we may feel it." Whilst he was superior, he was one day rashly accused in chapter of having done something against the rule. The saint could have easily confuted the slander and given a satisfactory account of his conduct, but he rose instantly from his seat, and, walking gently, with his eyes cast down into the middle of the chapter room, there fell on his knees, and begged penance and pardon of the fathers. The sight of this astonishing humility covered their accuser with such confusion and shame that he threw himself at the saint's feet, proclaimed him innocent, and loudly condemned himself. St. Lawrence so much dreaded the danger of worldly dissipation breaking in upon his solitude, that from the day on which he first entered the monastery to that of his death, he never set foot in his father's house, only when, with dry eyes, he assisted his mother and brothers on their deathbeds. St. Lawrence was promoted to the priesthood, and the fruit of the excellent spirit of prayer and compunction with which he was endowed was a wonderful experimental knowledge of spiritual things, and of the paths of interior virtue, and a heavenly light and prudence in the direction of souls. The tears which he abundantly shed at his devotions, especially whilst he offered the adorable sacrifice of the Mass, strongly affected all the assistants, and awakened their faith. And the raptures with which he was favored in prayer were wonderful, especially in saying Mass one Christmas night. Much against his inclination, he was chosen general of his order, which he governed with singular prudence and an extraordinary reputation for sanctity. He reformed its discipline in such a manner as to be afterwards regarded as its founder. Even in private conversation he used to give pathetic lessons of virtue, and that sometimes in one short sentence. And such was the unction with which he spoke on spiritual matters in private discourses as to melt the hearts of those who heard him. By his inflamed entertainments he awaked the tepid, filled the presumptuous with saving fear, raised the pusillanimous to confidence, and quickened the fervor of all. It was his usual saying that a religious man ought to tremble at the very name of the least transgression. He would receive very few into his order, and these thoroughly tried, saying that a state of such perfections and obligations is only for few, and its essential spirit and fervor are scarce to be maintained in multitudes. Yet in these conditions, not in the number of a religious community, its advantages and glory consists. It is not therefore to be wondered at that he was very attentive and rigorous in examining and trying the vocation of postulants. The most sincere and profound humility was the first thing in which he labored to ground his religious disciples, teaching them that it not only purges the soul of all lurking pride, but also that this alone inspires her with true courage and resolution by teaching her to place her entire confidence in God alone, the only source of her strength. The saint never ceased to preach to the magistrates and senators in times of war and all public calamities that, to obtain the divine mercy and the remedy of all evils with which they were afflicted, they ought, in the first place, to become perfectly sensible that they were nothing, for without this disposition of heart they could never hope for the divine assistance. His confidence in God's infinite goodness and power accordingly kept pace with his humility and entire distrust in himself, and assiduous prayer was his constant support. From the time he was made priest, he never failed saying Mass every day, unless he was hindered by sickness, and he used to say that it is a sign of little love if a person does not earnestly endeavor to be reunited to his Savior as often as he can. It was a maxim which he frequently repeated, that for a person to pretend to live chaste amid softness, ease, and continual gratifications of sense is as if a man should undertake to quench fire by throwing fuel upon it. He often put the rich in mind that they could not be saved but by abundant almsdeeds. His discourses consisted more of effective amorous sentiments than of studied thoughts, which sufficiently appears from his works. Pope Eugenius IV, being perfectly acquainted with the eminent virtue of our saint, obliged him to quit his cloister, and nominated him to the episcopal see of Venice in 1433. The holy man employed all manner of entreaties and artifices to prevent his elevation, and engaged his whole order to write in the same strain, in the most pressing manner, to his holiness, but to no effect. When he could no longer oppose the repeated orders of the Pope, he acquiesced with many tears. But such was his aversion to pomp and show that he took possession of his church so privately that his own friends knew nothing of the matter till the ceremony was over. The saint passed that whole night in the church at the foot of the altar, pouring forth his soul before God with many tears, and he spent in the same manner the night which preceded his consecration. Though he was bishop of so distinguished a see, in the ordering of his household he consulted only piety and humility, and when others told him that he owed some degree of state to his illustrious birth, to the dignity of his church, and to the commonwealth, his answer was that virtue ought to be the only ornament of the episcopal character, and that all the poor of the diocese composed the bishop's family. His household consisted only of 5 persons. He had no plate, making use only of earthenware. He lay on a scanty straw bed covered with a coarse rag, and wore no clothes but his ordinary purple cassock. His example, his severity to himself, and the affability and mildness with which he treated all others, won everyone's heart, and effected with ease the most difficult reformations which he introduced both among the laity and clergy. The flock loved and respected too much so holy a tender a parent and pastor, not to receive all his ordinances with docility and the utmost deference. When any private persons thwarted or opposed his pious designs, he triumphed over their obstinacy by meekness and patience. A certain powerful man, who was exasperated at a mandate the zealous bishop had published against stage entertainments, called him a scrupulous old monk, and endeavored to stir up the populace against him. Another time an abandoned wretch reproached him in the public streets as a hypocrite. The saint heard them without changing his countenance or altering his pace. He was no less unmoved amidst commendations and applause. By the very first visitation which he made, the face of his whole diocese was changed. He founded 15 religious houses and a great number of churches, and reformed those of all his diocese, officially with regard to the most devout manner of performing the divine office and the administration of the sacraments. Such was the good order and devotion that he established in his cathedral that it was a model to all Christendom. St. Lawrence founded several new canonries in it, and also in many other churches, and he increased the number of parishes in the city of Venice from 20 to 30. It is incredible what crowds every day resorted to the holy bishop's palace for advice, comfort, or alms. His gate, pantry, and coffers were always open to the poor. He gave alms more willingly in bread and clothes than in money, which might be ill spent. When he gave money, it was always in small sums. He employed pious matrons to find out and relieve the bashful poor, or persons of family in decayed circumstances. In the distribution of his charities, he had no regard to flesh and blood. When a poor man came to him, recommended by his brother Leonard, he said to him, "Go to him who sent you, and tell him from me that he is able to relieve you himself." No man ever had a greater contempt for money than our saint. He committed the care of his temporals to a faithful steward, and used to say that it is an unworthy thing for a pastor of souls to spend much of his precious time in casting up farthings. The popes held St. Lawrence in great veneration. Eugenius IV, having ordered our holy bishop to give him a meeting once at Bologna, saluted him with these words, "Welcome, the ornament of bishops." His successor, Nicholas V, earnestly sought an opportunity of giving him some singular token of particular esteem. When Dominic Micheli, Patriarch of Grado, happened to die in 1451, His Holiness, barely in consideration of the saint, transferred the patriarchal dignity to the See of Venice. Whilst this affair was debated in the Senate House, St. Lawrence repaired thither, and, being admitted, humbly declared his sincere and earnest desire of rather resigning a charge for which he was most unfit, in which he had borne against his will 18 years, than to feel his burden increased by this additional dignity. His humility and charity so strongly affected the whole Senate that the Doge himself was not able to refrain from tears, and cried out to the saint, conjuring him not to entertain such a thought or to raise any obstacle to the Pope's decree, which was expedient to the Church and most honorable to their country. St. Lawrence, after this new exaltation, considered himself as bound by a new tie to exert his utmost strength in laboring for the advancement of the divine honor and the sanctification of all the souls committed to his care. His advice was always satisfactory and healing to the various distempers of the human mind, and such was the universal opinion of his virtue, prudence, and penetration, and judgment, that causes decided by him were never admitted to a second hearing at Rome, but in all appeals his sentence was forthwith confirmed. Grounded in the most sincere and perfect contempt of himself, he seemed insensible and dead to the flattering temptation of human applause, which appeared to have no other effect upon him than to make him more profoundly to humble himself in his own soul, and before both God and men. When he was not able to refrain his tears, which proceeded from the tenderness and vehemence of his divine love, and from the wonderful spirit of compunction with which he was endowed, he used to accuse himself of weakness, and to too tender and compassionate a disposition of mind. But these he freely indulged at his private devotions, and by them he purified his affections more and more from earthly things, and moved the divine mercy to shower down the greatest blessings on others. The Republic was at that time shaken with violent storms and threatened with great dangers. A holy hermit who had served God with great fervor above 30 years in the Isle of Corfu assured a Venetian nobleman, as if it were from a divine revelation, that the city and Republic of Venice had been preserved by the prayers of the good bishop. The saint's nephew, who has accurately wrote his life in an elegant and pure style, mentions several miracles wrought by him, and certain prophecies of which he was himself witness. It appeared in many instances how perfectly the saint was mortified in his senses. A servant presenting him vinegar one day at table instead of wine and water, he drank it without saying a word. Out of love for holy poverty, in order to disengage his heart from the things of this world, he never had any books bound, but only sewed. St. Lawrence was 74 years old when he wrote his last work, entitled The Degrees of Perfection. He had just finished it when he was seized with a sharp fever. In his illness his servants prepared a bed for him, at which the true imitator of Christ was troubled, and said, "Are you laying a feather bed for me?" "No, that shall not be. My Lord was stretched on a hard and painful tree. Do not you remember that St. Martin said in his agony that a Christian ought to die on sackcloth and ashes? Nor could he be contented till he was laid on his straw. He forbade his friends to weep for him, and often cried out in raptures of joy, 'Behold the spouse! Let us go forth and meet him.' He added, with his eyes lifted up to heaven, 'Good Jesus, behold, I come.' At other times, weighing the divine judgments, he expressed sentiments of holy fear. One saying to him that he might go joyfully to his crown, he was much disturbed, and said, 'The crown is for valiant soldiers, not for base cowards such as I am.' During the 2 days that he survived after receiving extreme unction, the whole city came in turns, according to their different ranks, to receive his blessings. The saint would have even the beggars admitted, and gave to each class some short pathetic instruction. Seeing one Marcellus, a very pious young nobleman, who was his favorite disciple, weep most bitterly, he comforted him, giving him the following assurance: 'I go before, but you will shortly follow me. Next Easter we shall again meet in mutual embraces.' Marcellus fell sick in the beginning of Lent, and was buried in Easter week. St. Lawrence, closing his eyes, calmly expired on the 8th of January, in the year 1455, being 74 years old, having been honored with the episcopal dignity 22 years, and 4 with that of patriarch. During the contestation about the place of his burial, his body was preserved entire, without the least ill savor or sign of corruption, 67 days, and interred according to a decree of the Senate on the 17th of March. The ceremony of his beatification was performed by Clement VII in 1524, and that of his canonization by Alexander VIII in 1690. His festival is kept on the 5th of September, the day on which he was consecrated bishop.